So I'm looking at a picture of a sandwich that strikes me as like basically the quintessential Italian sandwich that you can get in New York City. It's on Italian bread with sesame, and it has like these layers of provolone, salami, ham. I think it's like eggplant parm, and like the juice from the parm is soaking into the bottom layer of bread and just squashing it slightly. And then there are all these condiments. When I saw this picture, I was like, oh, the person who got that sandwich knows what they're doing. They know where to go. They like know New York. This is a tweet by Andrew Yang, who is running to be mayor of New York. And it's one of many tweets about like excellent food in New York that I've noticed in the last couple weeks. And every time I see these Andrew Yang posts, I'm just like, wow, Andrew Yang's Grub Street diet would be really good. And that has been my main way into like following this campaign for mayor of the city that I live in, which is like quite an important job.
The primary election for the Democratic nomination for mayor of New York is June 22nd. That election will almost certainly determine who will become the next mayor of New York. The Republicans are really not expected to win, almost no matter who the Democrats nominate. So today on the show, we're going to figure out what Andrew Yang is all about. We're going to get into policy. We're going to get into local politics. We're going to try to figure out what his campaign means and what kind of mayor he would be. Although that is, I think, an impossible question to answer.
So the first person we're talking to is Annie Lowrey, who profiled Andrew Yang in The Atlantic. And then the second person we're talking to is Harry Siegel, who has closely been watching Andrew Yang and who knows all the ins and outs of New York City politics.
I'm Alex Pareene. I'm a staff writer at The New Republic.
And I'm Laura Marsh, the magazine's literary editor.
This is The Politics of Everything.
Okay, so before we talk to the experts, one thing that I just want to talk with you about is this kind of like phenomenon of Andrew Yang. I first heard of him when he was running for president, and he was this kind of like outside candidate. Since then, it feels like there is this like phenomenon of Andrew Yang, of like people who are incredibly devoted to him, who will like weigh into any conversation about Andrew Yang online fervently. And I just want to get a sense of what is this like Andrew Yang fandom?
The Yang Gang, yeah. I think there's a lot of things that sort of explaining it. One is that it's sort of increasingly and I think distressingly common for lots of political figures to have hives of stands.
So there's the K-Hive,
yeah,
the Bernie Bros.
Yeah.
A misnomer, but nonetheless, some kind of phenomenon.
And I think that's probably a subject for another episode, because I think there's a lot of things behind that. But with Yang in particular, a lot of things I think explain how he catapulted from being just some guy to being up there on that debate stage to now being the front runner for mayor of New York. And I think it's his legitimate skills as a politician. And also he did something smart when he ran for president, which is that he attached himself to one idea that is extremely popular when it's explained to people, and that is extremely popular on the internet. And he let that be his brand.
The idea that he's strongly associated with is UBI, this idea of a universal basic income, which is really popular in Silicon Valley, which is where Yang kind of emerges from. And that's the idea that he brought to the presidential debates.
And it's sort of cross-ideological too, right? Because cutting everyone a check appeals to people on the left. It appeals to these Silicon Valley types who have a sort of quasi-libertarian outlook. And it's an easy-to-explain idea too. And I think the Yang campaign in New York hugely benefits from the popularity of that idea, even if he's not actually necessarily running on what any reasonable person would call a UBI here.
I know I keep talking about sandwiches and it sounds like I'm obsessed with food, but I feel like a big part of his appeal, apart from the UBI, is that he seems to have a limitless enthusiasm for New York. And I think that you don't often see that in political campaigns, like a genuine excitement to live in the big city and go to like the cool spots. That seems to be a big part of the way he's presenting himself.
I think a lot of the other candidates really wish they could pull that off. People aren't excited to see Catherine Garcia, the former head of the Department of Sanitation, walk down the street. You know, she doesn't have strangers run up to her and say they loved her on a podcast. It's easier to, I think, pull off that kind of like, I'm having a blast, I love New York kind of feel when like people want to run up and fist bump you all the time.
Yeah. And I think having followed some of the more frivolous aspects of this campaign, the discourse around it, in some ways it's sort of uplifting because after a year of pandemic, seeing someone post about sandwiches, seeing them post about CrossFits, it just sort of feels relaxing, or it feels like the stakes have been lowered in this way that's a huge relief. And my kind of like underlying question or sneaking suspicion is like, is this all just harmless fun? Or are we missing what this campaign is about? Are we missing something really important about the mayoral race in New York? And I think also the phenomenon of Yang supporters goes beyond New York City voters. This is a local campaign, but it's actually attracting national attention and national interest from people who do not live in New York.
Including our first guest, Annie Lowrey.
Annie, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So you wrote about Andrew Yang, and in your piece, you witnessed this sort of dramatic encounter between Andrew Yang and some of his sort of enthusiastic supporters. Can you just describe that moment for us and kind of what you think that it shows about the way he sort of interacts with potential voters?
Yeah. So I followed him around in New York for a few days. He was campaigning pretty heavily. He really is kind of a national level political celebrity. He gets stopped on the street constantly, in part because he's walking with a bunch of assistants, all of whom are wearing like Yang masks. He loves talking to voters. He stops, he chats with everybody. Also, he was constantly telling, oh, you look so cool. And granted, like New Yorkers do really look cool, but he was always like, cool sneaks, amazing streetwear, you look so cool. Mm-hmm. And then we're on the Staten Island ferry. And I was sitting with him inside the ferry, and there was a Getty photographer named Spencer who was following him around. And a guy on the ferry came and like hit the photographer completely unprovoked with like a walking stick. And then they're scuffling. The photographer runs back into the ferry, presumably to go find the cops. Andrew Yang comes out, and the guy, the assailant, turns around and basically just stops and is like, Andrew Yang, I'm a fan. And like starts like just jibber jabbering about UBI. And I interviewed the guy afterwards, and he's just like been a fan of him since the presidential campaign and like knew a lot about his policies, was actually like gobsmacked to have met him, kept on thanking him for being there. And they had this very weirdly normal campaign interaction that just interrupted this otherwise really awful, completely unprovoked scene of violence. So that was the incident. And it was, I mean, insofar as I think if it was anything other than like one of these weird only in New York moments, he really, really is popular. And I think sort of one of his unusual qualities as a politician is he is just really sunny and kind of friendly and happy, and sort of slightly seems like half surprised to be there too. And I think that people like that, maybe even especially given that we're in this just absolutely on all levels apocalyptic moment in American life.
There's a lot of excitement around him. How much of it do you think is from the persona? But then there's also the policies themselves and the excitement about the ideas. What do you think is the core of the appeal policy-wise?
People know about the UBI thing, which he has sort of trimmed down from the presidential, from being like a freedom dividend, quote unquote, of $1,000 a month to everybody, to being this much smaller payment to the poorest New Yorkers. So what he's talking about really is like a welfare payment. It's kind of a dole. And it's a really good idea in the sense that you have a lot of New Yorkers who are living in deep poverty. It's a crisis. The cost of living crisis in New York is out of control, including for people much higher up the income scale. So it's kind of like all these big ideas, but then you're kind of like, well, how would this all work? And I don't have any idea. I don't think anybody does. I don't think he does either. His politics are actually a little unusual because you sort of squint and you're like, oh, he's maybe like a social democrat, maybe like a Bernie type person, right? Like he's pushing all of this new spending and unconditional spending. But then he has this very corporatist streak, and he's basically said that he wants to cut taxes, has all of these like pro-business, anti-regulatory policies. And it's an unusual and pretty unpopular brand of politics that you kind of only see coming from like Silicon Valley. I keep on going back and forth being like, well, is he really far to the left or really, really, stuck in the center? And I think the answer is yes. Like, I don't know that you can actually kind of like square that circle.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you just said, especially, people I think don't understand the complexity of this sort of ideology and voter patterns of the New York electorate, because everyone just says solidly Democratic city, right? But it contains a lot of populations with a wide variety of views. And Yang sort of being, in some sense, especially because he hasn't been defined by a career in city politics, that allows him to be the something for everyone candidate in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And he's never run for this before. He's never voted in a New York City mayoral election before. He doesn't have any history in city politics. And I think that a lot of voters, even the kind of, I hate this term, but quote unquote high information voters that show up to vote in primaries, the sort of just impressionistic sense of him as being like a smart guy who knows a lot about math and has big policy ideas and is like friendly. Like it's that impressionistic sense. And I do think that to the extent that people vote kind of emotionally, that's sort of benefiting him.
So you wrote that Yang wanted to get back into politics with the goal of accumulating as much personal influence as possible. Is that something he said?
Yeah, so he actually said this, which was so refreshing. I've never had a politician say this to me. He was like, yeah, I wanted like the biggest and most influential job possible. There's this kind of like honesty to it that I find sort of admirable and quite shocking, because I think if you asked any of the other 1,000 candidates in the race, they'd be like, I've gone block to block talking to people about what they want. I have really detailed ideas about how New York City changes and what we can deliver. And instead, he's like, it's a really big job and I think I can do great at it.
Other candidates aren't going to admit to you, well, I'm running for this job because I'm term limited out of the city council, right?
Well, this is the thing of this new phenomenon maybe of running for president as a way of getting a different job that is not president.
Yes.
So, I mean, we saw Bill de Blasio thought that being mayor of New York could maybe make him a credible candidate for president when he ran in the primary, whereas Pete Buttigieg and Andrew Yang have run for president, and that has led them towards like a job in the Biden administration or like running for mayor, which seems really counterintuitive. Mm-hmm. How do you think the two different Andrew Yang sort of like map onto each other? Like Andrew Yang, who ran as this like outside presidential primary candidate, who knew he wasn't going to get the nomination, versus like actually quite seriously looking like he might be the mayor of New York.
I think in Yang, you're seeing this like a deeply unusual, not unprecedented, but unusual, well, I'm going to build a national political profile out of like nothing. Really shocking that he was able to do it. And he really did. Because, I mean, man, like so many people run for president and you just never hear about it, especially on the single issue stuff. Mm-hmm. He's like, I'm going to take this policy that is never going to happen. And I have this kind of strange justification for it, which is that I think a robot jobs apocalypse that is like not currently occurring. We would know if it was, is coming, I swear. And I'm going to turn that into a national political profile. And he does it. And I actually wonder to what extent it will be a model for other people going forward. One trend that I do think this might reflect is there's just been this whole theory that all politics has become nationalized because of the media environment. I do just kind of wonder whether this will become much more of a model as opposed to the path that like a Bill Clinton or George W. Bush took.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on.
Yeah, I think it's especially interesting on the Republican side, where you have these like political celebrities that have really altered the party. I mean, so Donald Trump being obviously the big example here, he really wrenched the party in a direction that not a lot of quote unquote elites in the party wanted to go. And he did that with a brand of kind of racist, revanchist politics that they had sort of previously poo-pooed, but it worked. It worked kind of astonishingly. And so I think going forward, it's been interesting watching the reaction to like a Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Greene is the member of the House of Representatives from Georgia's 14th District, a right-wing CrossFit enthusiast and conspiracy theorist who essentially rode right-wing social media to a seat in Congress.
Who, importantly, like has no political power herself,
Right.
but has built this kind of astonishing national profile by just shitposting, basically. I have no idea how all of this plays out in the kind of chaotic level of national politics. But yeah, do these people go back and then sort of take these more local positions and keep on playing to that sort of like national political audience? You know, you have to presume that this is going to happen a lot more often.
All right, Annie, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thanks for having me.
So that's the take on Yang, the candidate for mayor, from a very talented reporter who happens to be an outsider to New York politics. After a short break, we'll be talking to someone who's been following it for years to get his take on Yang's campaign. For more political and social commentary by some of the country's most acclaimed independent journalists, subscribe to The New Republic with our New Year, New Administration sale. Get 3 months of unlimited digital access for just $5. You can take advantage of the deal at tnr.com/special offer. Before the break, we were talking with Annie Lowrey about what Andrew Yang's journey from campaigning for president to running for mayor of New York might augur for national politics. We're talking now to Harry Siegel, a longtime reporter here in the city, an editor at the Daily Beast, and a columnist for the New York Daily News. Harry, thank you for talking to us today.
Thanks for having me.
So, you're a lifelong New Yorker, and you've been covering politics in New York for a very long time. Why is Andrew Yang winning? Why is he ahead?
Look, he has a bunch of name recognition he banked from running a successful, in some ways appealing campaign for president. And people do different things with that. They're weird, different cash-in games. You know, Donald Trump ran for president to get rich and producered himself right into the White House. Mike Huckabee got a Fox show. People have started to figure this out, that there's just a lot of free TV time there. Andrew Yang, who'd never done that before, realized he's very good at campaigning and can do a TV thing, like a salesman can. And he said, what else can I do with this? And there seemed to be this opening running for mayor of New York. And he jumps in. He makes a whole bunch of bungles from jump, right? Like left New York City and said, can't imagine anyone staying in a 2-bedroom apartment here with 2 kids. I mean, really dumb stuff and sort of offensive, but he's nice seeming and sort of appealing. And the people who've taken shots at him have done a really bad job. And I think have actually helped him. So that when he shows up and smiles in response and projects the Vegas level of competence, a lot of these hits sort of redound to his advantage. If you're like cheerful and competent enough and people recognize you from another thing and they're like sort of, why not? And they don't love these other folks, that seems to be a pretty good sell. So, you know, you have no experience and a lot of what you say makes no damn sense. Your universal basic income idea that maybe makes sense, makes none in the New York context. Your basic income thing is just a completely different nonsense that doesn't apply and would only go to the very poorest New Yorkers. And I'm not against giving the poorest New Yorkers cash aid. It's just that the two things have nothing in common except 2 of the same words. So it sounds like, he's talking about that thing I already liked him from.
So he is running this campaign and he's walked into New York after never having even voted in one of these elections. Who is helping him run? Who are the people behind him?
So he has 2 campaign managers. Both of them are actually employed by Bradley Tusk's lobbying and general influence operation.
So Bradley Tusk is a political consultant, among other things. In this context, the most important thing to know about him is that he was one of the main strategists behind Michael Bloomberg's very controversial third mayoral campaign, in which he won a 3rd term. He founded Tusk Strategies in 2011, and this is a firm that lobbies government on behalf of corporations like Uber, Comcast, Google, Walmart. It's notable that Yang's campaign at the very top level is being run by people who are currently employees of Tusk Strategies. It's a campaign that is run out of a lobbying shop, right? I mean, that's wild, and that's not illegal or anything in New York.
You care, and I care, and we're both media elite people with outlets, but it turns out nobody cares what you and I care about here, sadly.
I've come to learn that lesson over the years. So do you think New York's business class, which has not been a huge fan of Bill de Blasio, may be wary of the progressiveness of the city council? Do you think that they're going to consolidate around Yang if he looks like the inevitable frontrunner?
Yes, and Yang is doing everything he can to indicate he's reasonably open to them. He says, look, we need people working in the city again and back in their offices. I'm going to make that happen. His policing stuff as well, which is very Manhattan and sort of Midtown oriented, right, is we're going to have an orderly city and a place where your people are going to come back. I'm not saying the disorder or the homeless people who are now living in hotels in different parts of the city or why people aren't going to work. I don't think that's the case. But I think a lot of the business class does. And if you're trying to sell yourself to them is, hey, I'm an amiable guy. We can, do business. That's a very reasonable approach. And I think he's absolutely trying to indicate he's somebody who is up to work with them.
Yang's been very proactive about reaching out to all these groups and saying, like, I can help. I'm here for you. I'll be the person who can do business with you. But he has no experience in government. How do you think he will govern if he's elected? I mean, what can he really get done? He has all these big ideas. He wants to help everyone, he says. But what's it actually like to be the mayor of New York City?
It's rough and it shifts a lot day to day. He's trying to indicate a few ways that he'll bring in experienced people around him. He mentioned the Catherine Garcia, the very impressive former sanitation commissioner, among many other things, for the de Blasio administration. Like the one person who left it without egg all over her face would be his number two, as a way of sort of signifying I would bring in grown-ups and people who do have this experience. But the main thing he's trying to do right now is win, because once you win, you can figure everything else out. And again, he doesn't know all that much. In my several conversations with him at this point, on and off the record, I find you ask like your two questions, and he says his stuff. I got it, and that's a reasonable script. And then you're like, well, let me start digging in here. Who would actually pay for this? What departments would it be going through? Like, basic, reasonable, focusing stuff. And he has no idea. And that's understandable since he's never had anything to do with governance in New York or participating here. But it's worrisome to see just how thin that is and to wonder what that would mean in a mayor. So I can't really answer that question, but I just feel like at a moment when the city's in real trouble, people just think, the guy seems nice and rolling the dice. I don't know about that, even if you think everything he does seems nice.
I mean, yeah, I, similarly to you, have been struck by the degree to which he just doesn't seem to know what the job of mayor will entail. My feeling is a lot of people haven't been paying much attention. And I think people like you and I have also been saying that for like a few months now. People aren't paying attention yet. Are the debates, is that when people will pay attention, or are we just going to sort of sleepwalk into this?
So he's the guy who has a substantial lead in the polls. No one has started spending their money yet out of the major candidates. So Scott Stringer is $8 million, and Eric Adams is $8 million, and Maya Wiley has $3 million, and Garcia has $3 million, and maybe they have some message or ad that really resonates and breaks through, and people are like, oh, that's the person. There's plenty of time for that to happen. Something happens in the debates. But, I don't think the numbers you're seeing right now are lies. And so you should go on the assumption that, like, Yang is on track to be our next mayor. And there's no foreseeable event that is necessarily changes that. And he'll have his own money to counterspend with that. Back to your question before about how he'd govern. If you ask him what he's going to do in Albany, Andrew Yang likes to talk a lot about how Pete's my friend, and Joe's my friend, and Kamala's my friend. Which really wounds me because it's so stupid. These people aren't his friends because they were on the campaign trail together. They're sure as fuck not giving New York billions of dollars for that reason. And if New Yorkers elect a guy mayor, because that's part of what he's saying, we deserve everything we get. As to Albany, which is where all the power is, and it's part of why no one's paying attention here, because Cuomo has his own, like, dickish problems, and like multiple fronts, many of them very serious, and that's drained a lot of attention, but that's where all the power is. The city is just like a sad creature of the state. You can't get anything done without Albany. And all Andrew Yang has to say about that, because he doesn't know anyone or anything there, I'll just show up on TV, and then Andrew Cuomo will do what I say. And it's like, no, Andrew Cuomo will crush you. Last thing I'll say here. So Cuomo has been going on all spring about how this is the spring of renewal for New York. And like, I'm doing like a fairy dance now. And you say that when you're a politician because you're fucked if things get worse. And hopefully they're going to get better. People have the vaccines, and then you can claim credit for it. And it was your manly leadership that got us there, right? But he doesn't know. And Yang, in the meantime, is saying the same thing. He's talking about a summer of love. And there are lots of like pent up, slightly crazed, mildly horny New Yorkers who are like, yes, that sounds great, right? If that happens, they're not going to be going out and like having good hookups because Andrew Yang said that. But like at the moment, these thin messages from, in Cuomo's case, bad, and in Yang's case, at least dangerous people are really resonating. And that worries me.
So I just want to be clear to our audience, if you hook up this summer, Andrew Yang is not the person you can thank for that. Andrew Yang had nothing to do with that.
Unless you hook up with Andrew Yang, in which case you should contact one of our outlets and we should talk.
Andrew Yang has sucked up a lot of the attention that there has been around this race. And major disclaimer for this podcast is I feel like we are participating in that by doing a whole episode on Andrew Yang. Who should we really be talking about that's in this race? I mean, who's worth paying attention to?
I think Catherine Garcia is like an intelligent, impressive person who's getting slept on because There's a Yogi Berra line about some hot spot, like nobody goes there anymore, it's too popular. Everyone I talk to who knows New York, from people ranging pretty far left to pretty far right by New York standards, who knows her, is like, this woman is impressive. She's capable of doing the stuff she says. And the stuff she says is actually, I think, very impressive and serious, more than she's getting credit for. As she's getting sort of sketched in as some sort of moderate, I think that she's not projecting language because she's trying to project competence. Unfortunately, women have had a very tough time raising money in New York, and that gets very chicken and eggy with name recognition and money. Maya Wiley's hit some of the same, but I think she's someone to take extremely seriously and is more than capable of the job at a very difficult moment for the city. There are a lot of interesting people here, and there have been roughly 700 million Zoom forums to date, right? So if people are actually interested or curious, there's plenty for them to dig into. The issue is none of them have managed to connect to previously checked out New Yorkers. And maybe having a more substantial message doesn't help with that, which is why all of us are now talking about this glib candidate who's just sort of selling, I'm successful because I'm succeeding, like, let's go. You know, what could go wrong?
Harry, that was very educational. Thank you again for talking to us.
Hey, nice talking with you guys. Thanks for having me, and keep up the great work at the magazine.
I think what we've learned is you definitely can trust Andrew Yang's food recommendations. I would eat a sandwich endorsed by Andrew Yang. I am still a little dubious about voting for him. What do you think, Laura?
You know, I think it's so easy to get swept up in the enthusiasm for New York after a year of stuff being closed down in the city, of being cooped up. And I think that's why Andrew Yang's presence as a candidate has really appealed to me. But I feel like, talking to Harry about all the coverage that the media has given Andrew Yang disproportionately, it's hard not to just stop for a minute and think, should we have made a podcast episode about all of the candidates in the race? Yeah. Should we have made a podcast episode about what New York needs from a mayor in the year when it's going to be recovering from this global pandemic?
I mean, we are obviously part of the problem, as I like to think we regularly acknowledge. But I mean, that's a great point. A podcast about, or an episode about not who New York's mayor should be out of this list of people, but about what qualities that person needs to have. Maybe that would have been a more honorable use of our time, as much as I enjoyed talking and learning about Andrew Yang this week.
My fear is that we find out what the job entails the hard way when someone who isn't equipped for it gets the job and we're living with their failures for the next several years.
It'll just be more
Bill de Blasio.
Yeah, it'll be more content for future episodes of The Politics of Everything. The Politics of Everything is co-produced by Talkhouse.
Emily Cook is our executive producer. If you enjoy The Politics of Everything and want to help support the show, one thing you can do is share your favorite episode with a friend.
Thanks for listening.